Picture this. You're walking down a military corridor, wearing your uniform with pride, when suddenly a group of soldiers starts laughing and pointing at you.
They whisper cruel jokes about your appearance, your rank, your very presence in their sacred halls.
Your heart sinks as their mockery echoes off the walls. You feel small, invisible, worthless. But what if I told you that in less than 5 minutes, those same soldiers would be standing at perfect attention, their faces pale with shock and regret? What if 4 of the most powerful military leaders in the country were about to walk through those doors and render a salute that would silence every doubter in that corridor forever? This is the true story of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a woman whose journey from ridicule to respect reveals the hidden strength that lies within us all. It's a story about judgment, redemption, and the moment when everything changes. Because sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is exactly the one who will surprise you beyond your wildest imagination. Are you ready to witness a transformation that will make you question everything you think you know about strength, courage, and the power of perseverance? Then step into that corridor with Sarah and prepare to see what happens when destiny calls your name. The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Fort Bradley as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her uniform one final time before entering the main administrative building. At 28 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with delicate features that had earned her countless underestimations throughout her military career. Her black hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her uniform was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Sarah had been stationed at Fort Bradley for only 3 weeks, transferred from a smaller base in Nevada where she had served with distinction for the past 4 years. The transfer had come suddenly, accompanied by sealed orders that even she wasn't fully privy to. All she knew was that her new assignment involved intelligence work of the highest classification, and she was to report directly to Colonel Morrison in the Strategic Operations Division. As she walked through the corridors of the administrative building, Sarah noticed the curious glances from other personnel. Fort Bradley was one of the largest military installations on the West Coast, home to over 15,000 active-duty personnel. It was a place where careers were made and broken, where the best and brightest competed for advancement and recognition. For someone like Sarah, who had spent most of her career at smaller, more intimate bases, the sheer scale of Fort Bradley was both intimidating and exhilarating. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0800 hours, and Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, as was her habit. She found herself in Corridor C, a long hallway that connected the main briefing rooms to the senior officers' quarters. The corridor was lined with portraits of distinguished military leaders, their stern faces watching over all who passed beneath them. Sarah paused to examine one particularly impressive portrait of General Patricia Hawkins, one of the few female generals in recent military history, known for her brilliant tactical mind and unwavering dedication to her soldiers. As Sarah stood there, lost in thought about the legacy she hoped to build for herself, she became aware of voices approaching from behind. A group of 5 soldiers, all men, all appearing to be in their early 30s, were walking in her direction. Their ranks indicated they were sergeants and corporals, non-commissioned officers with several years of experience under their belts. The leader of the group, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, was a broad-shouldered man with a confident swagger that spoke of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. As the group drew closer, Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation, which seemed to revolve around weekend plans and complaints about recent policy changes. She stepped aside slightly to let them pass, maintaining the respectful distance that military protocol demanded. However, as the group passed her, Sergeant Rodriguez's eyes fell upon her slight frame and youthful appearance. He exchanged a meaningful glance with his companions, and Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had experienced this before countless times throughout her career, the moment when others sized her up and found her wanting based solely on her appearance. Rodriguez slowed his pace and turned to his companions with a smirk. "Doctor says that it meant something at once." "Well, well," he said in a voice just loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Looks like they're sending children to do soldiers' work these days." His comment elicited chuckles from his group, and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger.
Corporal James Patterson, a lanky man with prematurely gray hair, joined in the mockery.
"Maybe she's lost," he suggested with mock concern. "Someone should help her find the visitors center. I don't think the Girl Scouts meet here, sweetheart." The group erupted in laughter, clearly pleased with their wit. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that reacting to such comments only encouraged more of the same behavior. Instead, she continued walking toward her destination, hoping to escape the uncomfortable situation with her dignity intact. But the group wasn't finished with her yet. Sergeant Rodriguez picked up his pace to match hers, walking alongside her with exaggerated casualness. "Hey there, Lieutenant," he said, reading her rank insignia with exaggerated surprise. "Lieutenant! Can you believe that, boys? They're handing out officer ranks like participation trophies these days." Another member of the group, Corporal Danny Walsh, a stocky man with a thick Boston accent, probably got fast-tracked through some diversity program, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Can't have been merit-based promotion, that's for sure. Look at her, she looks like she'd blow away in a strong wind.
The comments were cutting deeper than Sarah cared to admit.
Throughout her career, she had faced skepticism and prejudice, but she had always responded by working twice as hard as her male counterparts, proving herself through actions rather than words. She had earned her rank through dedication, intelligence, and sacrifice, completing some of the most challenging training programs the military had to offer. Sarah had graduated summa cum laude from West Point with degrees in international relations and computer science. She had completed Ranger School, one of only a handful of women to do so at the time, enduring months of grueling physical and mental challenges that had broken men twice her size. She spoke 4 languages fluently and had specialized training in cryptography, psychological operations, and advanced tactical planning. But none of that seemed to matter to the men who were now circling her like sharks sensing blood in the water. To them, she was just a small woman in a uniform she hadn't earned, taking up space that rightfully belonged to someone more deserving. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential whisper, but was still clearly audible to Sarah. "I heard she's supposed to be working in strategic ops," he said to his companions. "Can you imagine? They're probably giving her some cushy desk job filing reports and fetching coffee for the real officers."
The group had now completely surrounded Sarah, forcing her to stop walking.
She found herself in the middle of the corridor with nowhere to go but forward through their human wall of mockery and disdain.
The portraits on the walls seemed to look down at her with disappointment, as if questioning whether she truly belonged among their ranks.
Corporal Patterson leaned against the wall with feigned casualness. "You know what I think?" he said, addressing his companions while pointedly ignoring Sarah. "I think someone made a mistake with the orders. This one should be working in the mess hall, or maybe the daycare center on base. This is the book, it's about history, somewhere more suited to her obvious talents." The laughter that followed was harsh and cruel, echoing off the corridor walls and making Sarah feel as though the entire building was mocking her. She tried to step forward, to continue on her way to the briefing room, but Sergeant Rodriguez moved to block her path.
"Now hold on there, Lieutenant," he said with mock politeness.
"We're just having a friendly conversation here. No need to rush off. We're all military family, right? We should get to know each other better." Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she would have liked. "Excuse me, Sergeant," she said, trying to inject authority into her tone. "I think this is the book, it's about history enough to do enough of this. I have a briefing to attend and I need to get by." Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. "Oh, she speaks," he announced to his companions.
"And listen to that, boys. She's giving me orders."
A little lieutenant thinks she can tell an experienced NCO what to do. The situation was escalating, and Sarah could feel panic beginning to creep into her chest. She had faced combat situations that were less stressful than this moment in the corridor. At least in combat, the enemy was clearly defined, and the rules of engagement were understood by all parties. The Capitol's built on this as against its stand. Here she was dealing with people who were supposed to be on her side, fellow soldiers who should have been treating her with respect and professionalism.
Corporal Walsh stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that made Sarah's skin crawl.
"You know what your problem is, sweetheart?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't understand how things work around here. This isn't some politically correct training exercise. This is the real military, where respect is earned, not handed out with your commission." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of the situation. She could report the incident, but she knew that would likely make her even more of a target. She could try to push through them, but that might escalate the situation into something physical, which would reflect poorly on her regardless of who started it. She could continue to stand there and take their abuse, hoping they would eventually tire of their game and move on. None of the options seemed particularly appealing, and Sarah felt a familiar sense of isolation that had plagued her throughout much of her military career.
It was the feeling of being fundamentally alone, surrounded by people who were supposed to be her brothers and sisters in arms, but who saw her as an outsider, an interloper who didn't belong in their exclusive club.
As the group continued their verbal assault, Sarah found herself thinking about her father, Colonel David Chen, who had served with distinction for 30 years before retiring. He had always told her that the military was a place where merit mattered more than appearances, where dedication and service were the only currencies that counted. She wondered what he would think of this moment, whether he would be proud of her for maintaining her composure, or disappointed that she hadn't found a way to command the respect she deserved. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, with no sign of other personnel who might intervene or provide a distraction. The morning sun had shifted, and the shadows were now shorter, indicating that time was passing and her briefing was approaching. Sarah knew she needed to extract herself from this situation quickly, but she also knew that how she handled the next few moments would likely define her reputation at Fort Bradley for months or even years to come. Sergeant Rodriguez was still talking, his voice growing more animated as he fed off the energy of his companions.
I bet she's never even seen real action, he was saying.
Probably spent her whole career in safe little assignments, protected from anything that might mess up her pretty uniform. The irony of his comment was almost laughable to Sarah, who had 3 combat deployments under her belt and had been decorated for valor on 2 separate occasions. But she knew that explaining her background would only make her seem defensive,
And would likely provoke even more mockery from the group.
Instead, she took a deep breath and tried to center herself, drawing on the meditation technique she had learned during her advanced training. She reminded herself that this moment would pass, that these men's opinions of her didn't define her worth or her capabilities.
It's a crime of being faced in dirt and defining myself as much as what I put this.
She had faced worse than this and had always emerged stronger on the other side. As the mockery continued, Sarah's mind drifted to the events that had led her to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, she had been quietly working at her desk at Camp Henderson in Nevada when her commanding officer, Major Richards, had approached her with an expression she had never seen before. It was a mixture of pride, excitement, and something that looked almost like envy.
Lieutenant Chen, he had said, holding a sealed envelope with official markings. You've received new orders.
Effective immediately, you're being transferred to Fort Bradley for special assignment. He paused, studying her face carefully. This is highly unusual, Sarah. Transfers like this, with this level of classification, they don't happen unless someone very important has taken notice of your work. Sarah had spent the next 3 days processing her transfer, packing her belongings, and saying goodbye to the soldiers she had served alongside for 4 years. Camp Henderson had been her first real assignment out of training, and she had grown close to many of the personnel there. They had seen her prove herself time and again, and by the time of her transfer, she was respected and valued as both an officer and a colleague. The sealed orders she carried had provided minimal information about her new role. She was to report to Colonel Morrison in the Strategic Operations Division for assignment to Project Nightfall, a classification level so high that even the name seemed ominous. All she knew was that her background in cryptography and psychological operations had somehow attracted the attention of people far above her pay grade. Now, standing in this corridor being subjected to the cruel laughter of men who knew nothing about her qualifications or accomplishments, Sarah felt the weight of isolation more heavily than ever before. At Camp Henderson, incidents like this had become increasingly rare as her reputation for competence and reliability had grown. Here at Fort Bradley, she was starting from zero, with no allies and no established credibility to fall back on.
In fact, here I want England. Can I build into that?
Corporal Patterson had moved closer during her moment of reflection, and she realized he was speaking directly to her now.
I asked you a question, Lieutenant, he said with mock patience. Don't tell me you're too good to answer a simple question from an enlisted man. Sarah blinked, realizing she had missed whatever he had said while lost in her thoughts. I'm sorry, Corporal, she said, trying to maintain professional courtesy despite the circumstances. Could you repeat the question? This admission seemed to delight the group, who exchanged knowing glances as if her momentary distraction confirmed all their suspicions about her competence.
Sergeant Rodriguez slapped his knee with exaggerated enthusiasm. She wasn't even listening, he announced to his companions.
Too important to pay attention to us working folk, I guess.
Probably thinking about her next manicure appointment, or wondering if the commissary carries the right shade of lipstick.
The comments were becoming increasingly personal and inappropriate, crossing lines that should never be crossed between professional military personnel. Sarah felt her patience beginning to wear thin, but she also knew that losing her temper would only give them more ammunition to use against her. Corporal Walsh had pulled out his phone and was holding it up as if recording the interaction.
This is going to be great,
he said with obvious glee.
Wait until the boys in the barracks see this. Little Miss Officer getting schooled in the real world.
The threat of having this humiliation recorded and shared throughout the base was almost more than Sarah could bear. She had worked so hard to build her reputation, to prove that she belonged in the military despite the doubts and prejudices of others. The thought of becoming a laughingstock before she had even had a chance to demonstrate her abilities at Fort Bradley was devastating. Please don't record this, she said, hating the way her voice sounded small and pleading.
This isn't appropriate, and you know it.
Sergeant Rodriguez stepped between Sarah and Walsh, holding up his hand in a gesture of mock protection. Now, he said with exaggerated chivalry. We can't have our little lieutenant getting upset. Maybe we should call someone to come get her. Does anyone know if they have a counselor on base for when the stress gets to be too much?
The laughter that followed was particularly harsh, and Sarah felt something inside her begin to break.
She had endured years of this type of treatment, always telling herself that it would get better, that eventually her work would speak for itself and the doubts would fade away. But standing here in this corridor, surrounded by men who seemed determined to break her spirit, she wondered if she had been naive to believe that things would ever truly change. Corporal Patterson had leaned against the wall again, clearly settling in for what he expected to be an extended session of entertainment.
You know what I heard? He said conversationally to his companions while keeping his eyes fixed on Sarah.
I heard she got her commission through some kind of special program for disadvantaged groups.
Affirmative action in action, boys.
The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had worked harder than anyone she knew to earn her place in the military. Her grades at West Point had been exceptional, her performance in training had been outstanding, and her service record was spotless. The suggestion that she had somehow received special treatment because of her gender or ethnicity was not only false but deeply insulting. That's not true, she said, finding her voice at last. I earned my commission the same way everyone else did, through hard work and dedication. Sergeant Rodriguez turned to face her with exaggerated surprise.
Oh, she's defending herself now, he announced. How precious.
Tell us, Lieutenant, what exactly have you accomplished that makes you think you deserve to wear those bars?
It was a trap, and Sarah knew it. If she listed her accomplishments, she would sound defensive and boastful.
If she remained silent, they would take it as confirmation that she had nothing to be proud of. Either way, she couldn't win this exchange on their terms. Before she could respond, Corporal Walsh jumped back into the conversation with renewed enthusiasm.
I bet she's never even fired a weapon in combat, he said with conviction.
Probably spent her whole deployment safe behind a desk somewhere, counting paper clips and organizing filing systems. The comment was so far from the truth that Sarah almost laughed despite her distress. Her combat experience included 3 deployments to active war zones, where she had not only fired her weapon but had been credited with saving the lives of multiple fellow soldiers through her quick thinking and tactical expertise. She had been awarded the Bronze Star for her actions during a particularly intense firefight in Afghanistan, where her analysis of enemy communications had allowed her unit to anticipate and counter an ambush that could have resulted in significant casualties. But she knew that explaining any of this would only provoke more skepticism and mockery from the group. They had clearly made up their minds about who she was and what she represented, and no amount of evidence to the contrary was likely to change their opinions.
As the group continued their verbal assault, Sarah became aware of footsteps approaching from the far end of the corridor. Her heart leaped with hope that someone might intervene, perhaps a senior officer who would put an end to this unprofessional behavior.
But as the footsteps grew closer, she realized they belonged to another group of soldiers, and her hope quickly turned to dread at the thought that her humiliation was about to become even more public.
The approaching group consisted of 3 soldiers, all wearing the same smug expressions as Rodriguez and his companions.
It was clear that news of the confrontation had spread, and these newcomers had come to witness the entertainment firsthand.
"What do we have here?" asked Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson, the leader of the new group.
He was a tall, imposing man with a shaved head and numerous tattoos visible on his forearms. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sergeant Rodriguez turned to greet the newcomers with obvious satisfaction.
"Just having a friendly conversation with our new lieutenant here?" he said with a grin.
Trying to help her understand how things work at a real military base, Staff Sergeant Thompson walked slowly around Sarah, examining her with the same detached interest someone might show when inspecting a piece of equipment. He said thoughtfully. They're certainly making them smaller these days. You sure she's old enough to be an officer? Maybe someone should check her ID. The suggestion that she might be underage was particularly galling to Sarah, who was actually older than at least half the men currently surrounding her. But her youthful appearance had always been a source of frustration in her professional life, leading to assumptions and disrespect that she constantly had to overcome. Corporal Patterson had found a new angle for his attack.
I wonder what her family thinks about her playing soldier, he mused aloud. Probably breaks her poor mother's heart seeing her little girl pretending to be something she's not.
The comment about her family struck a particularly sensitive nerve for Sarah.
Her father, Colonel David Chen, was a decorated war hero who had served his country with distinction for 3 decades. Her mother, Dr. Linda Chen, was a respected surgeon who had volunteered her time treating wounded veterans. Both parents had supported her decision to join the military and had been proud of her accomplishments every step of the way. The suggestion that her family would be anything other than proud of her service was not only wrong but deeply hurtful. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, and she blinked rapidly to prevent them from falling. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Staff Sergeant Thompson had noticed her emotional reaction and seemed pleased by it. "Oh, look at that, boys," he said with mock sympathy. "I think we hurt her feelings. Maybe we should apologize to the little lieutenant." The chorus of fake apologies that followed was more humiliating than the original insults. "Sorry, ma'am," they said in unison, their voices dripping with sarcasm. "We didn't mean to upset you. Please don't report us to your daddy." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to center herself and find the strength to endure whatever came next. She thought about all the obstacles she had overcome to reach this point in her career, all the people who had believed in her potential when others had doubted. She thought about the soldiers she had served alongside in combat, who had trusted her with their lives and had never once questioned her capabilities. When she opened her eyes, she found herself looking directly at the portrait of General Patricia Hawkins, whose stern gaze seemed to offer encouragement and strength. "Those who pee and make and done youths." Sarah remembered reading about General Hawkins' career, how she had faced similar challenges and prejudices throughout her rise through the ranks, never allowing the doubts of others to dim her own sense of purpose and dedication. The corridor had grown quiet, and Sarah realized that the men were waiting for her to react, to break down or lash out in a way that would validate their assumptions about her weakness and unsuitability for military service. But as she stood there, drawing strength from the memory of those who had paved the way before her, she felt something shift inside her. She would not give them what they wanted. She would not break, would not cry, would not provide them with the entertainment they so desperately craved. "Phase is out of the fall of termination, Don." Instead, she would endure this moment with the dignity and grace that befitted an officer in the United States Army. The realization seemed to frustrate the group, who had clearly expected a more dramatic reaction to their efforts. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone as he sensed that his tactics were not having the desired effect. The tension in the corridor had reached a breaking point. Sergeant Rodriguez, frustrated by Sarah's refusal to react as expected, decided to escalate his approach. His face had darkened with anger, and his voice carried a threatening undertone that made several of his companions shift uncomfortably. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he said, stepping so close to Sarah that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You think those little bars on your collar make you special, make you worthy of respect you haven't earned." Sarah maintained eye contact with him, drawing on every ounce of inner strength she possessed. Her father had taught her that respect in the military was earned through actions, not words, and that sometimes the most powerful response was silence coupled with unwavering dignity. Staff Sergeant Thompson, sensing an opportunity to join Rodriguez's more aggressive approach, moved to Sarah's other side, effectively trapping her between them.
You know what I think? He said, his voice low and menacing.
"I think someone needs to teach our little lieutenant here about the real chain of command, about who really runs things around here."
The implied threat was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This had moved far beyond simple hazing or unprofessional behavior. These men were now actively intimidating her, using their size and numbers to create a sense of physical menace that had no place in any professional environment, let alone a military one. Corporal Walsh, emboldened by the escalating situation, had moved to block the corridor behind Sarah, cutting off any potential escape route. "Maybe she needs a practical demonstration," he suggested with a cruel smile. "Show her what happens to officers who don't understand their place." Sarah's mind raced as she assessed her options. She was trained in hand-to-hand combat and was confident in her abilities, but she was outnumbered 8-1, and any physical altercation would likely result in her being blamed regardless of who initiated it. The military justice system, while designed to be fair, still operated within a culture where women who defended themselves were often seen as aggressive or problematic.
The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control when Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. At the far end of the corridor, barely visible through the crowd of men surrounding her, she caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was approaching, though she couldn't yet make out who it was, or whether their arrival would help or worsen her predicament.
Sergeant Rodriguez had noticed her momentary distraction and interpreted it as fear. "That's right," he said with satisfaction. "Now you're starting to understand. This isn't some diversity training exercise where everyone gets a participation trophy. This is the real military, where weakness gets people killed." The approaching footsteps were getting closer, and Sarah could now make out the sound of multiple people walking in perfect synchronization. It was the distinctive rhythm of military personnel moving in formation, but something about the sound seemed different, more purposeful and formal than the casual gait of soldiers simply walking through the building. Corporal Patterson, who had been unusually quiet for the past few minutes, suddenly looked uncomfortable. "Hey, Rodriguez," he said in a low voice. "Maybe we should wrap this up. I think I hear someone coming." But Rodriguez was too caught up in the moment to pay attention to his companion's warning.
He had moved even closer to Sarah, close enough that she could see the anger burning in his eyes.
You want to know what I really think? He continued, his voice rising with each word.
I think you're a joke. A politically correct appointment designed to make some general feel good about diversity quotas.
"You don't belong here, and everyone knows it." The footsteps were much closer now, and Sarah could hear the faint sound of voices engaged in serious conversation.
What? What? How fucking polite about?
The approaching group seemed to be discussing something of significant importance, their tones suggesting matters far more consequential than the petty harassment taking place in the corridor. Staff Sergeant Thompson had also become aware of the approaching sounds, and his demeanor began to change subtly. The confidence and aggression he had displayed moments earlier seemed to waver as he recognized something in the rhythm and tone of the approaching group. "Rodriguez," he said urgently, "we need to move now." But Rodriguez was beyond hearing his companion's warnings. His anger had reached a crescendo, and he was determined to deliver what he saw as a final, devastating blow to Sarah's confidence and reputation. "You want to know what really bothers me about people like you?" he snarled, his face now inches from hers. "You take spots that should go to real soldiers, people who've actually earned the right to lead. You're nothing but a diversity hire with a fancy uniform, and everyone in this building knows it." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, their cruelty and unfairness reverberating off the corridor walls. Sarah felt something inside her break at that moment, not from weakness, but from the sheer injustice of the accusation. She had given everything to earn her place in the military, had sacrificed relationships, comfort, and security to serve her country with honor and distinction. But before she could formulate a response, the approaching footsteps reached the entrance to their section of the corridor, and Sarah heard a voice that made her blood freeze in her veins. What exactly is going on here? The voice was calm, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. It cut through the tension in the corridor like a blade, instantly silencing the crowd of men who had been so confident in their harassment just moments before. Sarah turned toward the voice and felt her knees nearly buckle as she recognized the speaker. General Patricia Morrison, the commanding officer of Fort Bradley, stood at the head of a group of 4 high-ranking officers. General Morrison was a legend in military circles, known for her strategic brilliance, her uncompromising standards, and her absolute intolerance for unprofessional behavior. Behind General Morrison stood 3 other officers whose presence made the situation even more surreal. Colonel James Harrison, the base's deputy commander and a recipient of the Medal of Honor for his actions in Iraq. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos, the head of strategic operations and one of the most respected intelligence officers in the military. And Major General Robert Chen, Sarah's father. The group of enlisted men who had been so confident and aggressive moments earlier now stood frozen like deer caught in headlights. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been leaning over Sarah with such menace just seconds before, now stood ramrod straight, his face pale with shock and fear. General Morrison walked slowly into the center of the group, her eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. She was a tall woman with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through anyone who tried to deceive her. Her uniform was immaculate, and she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had never backed down from a fight in her life. "I asked a question," she said quietly, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent corridor. "What is going on here?" None of the enlisted men seemed capable of speech. They stood in various states of attention, some having automatically snapped to the position when they recognized the rank of the approaching officers, others still frozen in the casual poses they had adopted while harassing Sarah. Sarah herself was struggling to process the surreal turn of events. The presence of her father among the group of officers was particularly shocking. Major General Chen maintained his professional composure, but Sarah could see the barely controlled anger in his eyes as he took in the scene before him. General Morrison walked slowly around the group, her gaze lingering on each of the enlisted men before settling on Sarah herself.
"Lieutenant Chen,"
She said formally.
"are you injured?"
Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she would have liked.
"No, ma'am, I'm not injured."
Good, General Morrison replied. She turned her attention back to the group of enlisted men, who were now sweating visibly, despite the cool temperature in the corridor. Now, I'm going to ask again, and this time I expect a complete and honest answer. What was happening here when we arrived? Sergeant Rodriguez, recognizing that silence was no longer an option, attempted to salvage the situation.
Ma'am, he said, his voice shaking slightly, we were having a conversation with the lieutenant.
Getting to know our new personnel.
General Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at this obvious evasion.
A conversation,
She repeated slowly. How interesting. Lieutenant Chen, would you characterize what was happening here as a conversation?
Sarah found herself at a crossroads.
She could minimize the incident, try to smooth things over and avoid creating enemies so early in her assignment at Fort Bradley, or she could tell the truth and risk being seen as someone who couldn't handle the normal rough and tumble of military life. Looking into General Morrison's eyes, Sarah realized that there was only one acceptable choice.
Ma'am, she said clearly, these soldiers were engaging in harassment and intimidation.
They made inappropriate comments about my qualifications, my appearance, and my right to serve as an officer. The behavior was unprofessional and unbecoming of military personnel. The silence that followed Sarah's statement was deafening. The group of enlisted men looked as though they wanted to disappear into the floor, while the senior officers maintained expressions of professional neutrality that somehow managed to be more intimidating than open anger.
Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his Medal of Honor ribbon clearly visible among his many decorations. Sergeant Rodriguez, he said formally, is Lieutenant Chen's account accurate? Rodriguez opened his mouth as if to deny the accusation, but no words came out. The weight of the moment, the presence of so many senior officers, and the undeniable truth of what had transpired had rendered him speechless.
Lieutenant Colonel Santos moved to examine the group more closely, her intelligence background evident in the way she seemed to read the body language and expressions of each individual present.
I'm seeing a lot of guilty faces, she observed quietly.
And I'm hearing a distinct lack of denials. The situation had shifted completely in the span of just a few moments. The men who had been so confident in their power to humiliate and intimidate Sarah now found themselves facing the very real prospect of severe disciplinary action from some of the most senior officers on the base.
Major General Chen had remained silent throughout the exchange, but Sarah could see the struggle in his face as he balanced his role as her father with his responsibilities as a senior officer. The pain in his eyes as he witnessed the treatment his daughter had endured was evident, but his military bearing never wavered.
General Morrison walked back to the center of the group, her presence commanding absolute attention from everyone present. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of decades of military experience and absolute authority.
Let me make something very clear to all of you, she said, her words cutting through the tension like a sword. What I witnessed here today is not just unprofessional behavior.
If you are saying this is a time to repent, it is a violation of everything this military stands for. It is a betrayal of the trust placed in you as soldiers and as representatives of the United States Army.
The general's words seemed to physically impact the group of enlisted men, several of whom visibly flinched at the harshness of her assessment. Sarah felt a surge of validation and relief as someone in authority finally acknowledged the severity of what had taken place.
But even as she felt vindicated, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what the consequences would be for everyone involved.
She had wanted to prove herself at Fort Bradley, to establish herself as a competent and respected officer. Instead, her very first week had resulted in a major incident that would undoubtedly follow her throughout her assignment.
You hold. What doesn't that do about history?
The corridor that had been filled with cruel laughter and harassment just minutes earlier was now silent, except for the sound of breathing and the distant hum of air conditioning. The portraits on the walls seemed to look down with approval at the justice being served, while the morning sun continued its progression across the floor.
Marking the passage of time in a moment that would change everything for everyone present.
General Morrison's presence had transformed the corridor into something resembling a military tribunal. The weight of authority and consequence hung heavy in the air as she continued her assessment of the situation. Her eyes moved methodically from one enlisted man to the next, cataloging their expressions and body language with the precision of someone who had spent decades reading people under pressure. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence like a whip crack.
Step forward. Thompson moved with obvious reluctance, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. As he approached the general, his shoulders were hunched with shame, and his eyes were fixed firmly on the floor.
"Look at me when I'm speaking to you, Staff Sergeant," General Morrison commanded, her tone brooking no argument. Thompson's head snapped up, revealing a face pale with fear and regret. The confident, intimidating figure who had helped corner Sarah just minutes earlier now looked like a frightened child caught in a serious transgression. "Tell me, Staff Sergeant," the general continued, "how long have you been in the Army?" 14 years, ma'am," Thompson replied, his voice barely above a whisper. 14 years, General Morrison repeated thoughtfully. "Long enough to understand military courtesy, respect for officers, and appropriate professional behavior. Long enough to know better." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Long enough to be setting an example for younger soldiers rather than leading them astray." The rebuke was devastating in its quiet intensity. Thompson's face flushed with shame as the full weight of his actions and their implications became clear to him. He was not just facing personal consequences. His behavior had influenced and encouraged others to participate in the harassment. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his presence adding another layer of gravity to the proceedings. "During my years in combat," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death alongside his fellow soldiers, "I learned that the strength of a unit depends entirely on trust, respect, and mutual support. What you men demonstrated here today is the exact opposite of everything we stand for as an army." The colonel's words carried particular weight because of his combat experience and his Medal of Honor. This was not some rear echelon officer lecturing them about textbook principles. This was a warrior who had earned his insights through blood, sweat, and sacrifice.
On the battlefield,
Lieutenant Colonel Santos moved closer to the group of enlisted men, her intelligence background evident in the way she seemed to analyze each individual. "What concerns me most," she said thoughtfully, "is the coordinated nature of this harassment." This wasn't a spontaneous moment of poor judgment. This was organized, deliberate, and sustained. That suggests a level of premeditation that makes this incident far more serious. Her observation sent visible shockwaves through the group. The difference between a moment of poor judgment and premeditated harassment was significant in terms of military justice, and everyone present understood the implications. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been the ringleader of the harassment, finally found his voice. "Ma'am," he said desperately, "we didn't mean any real harm. We were just having some fun. We didn't think—" "You didn't think," General Morrison interrupted, her voice rising slightly for the first time since her arrival. "That's exactly the problem, Sergeant. You didn't think about your duty as a soldier. You didn't think about your responsibility to maintain good order and discipline. You didn't think about the oath you took to support and defend the Constitution, which includes equal protection under the law." The general's words were like hammer blows, each point driving home the magnitude of their failure not just as individuals, but as soldiers. The oath they had all taken when they enlisted was not just a formality, it was a sacred commitment that they had violated through their actions. Major General Chen had remained silent throughout most of the exchange, his face a mask of professional composure despite the obvious emotional turmoil of watching his daughter being treated with such disrespect. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a father's pain combined with a senior officer's authority. "Lieutenant Chen," he said formally, addressing his daughter with the protocol required by their respective ranks and the public nature of the situation, "has served this army with distinction for 7 years.
I cannot see for an after balance of price in the United States. You have not seen any of the persons afforded pay."
She is a graduate of West Point, a Ranger qualified officer, and a decorated combat veteran with 3 deployments. Her qualifications and accomplishments speak for themselves.
The revelation of Sarah's background hit the group of enlisted men like a physical blow.
The small woman they had dismissed as a diversity hire and questioned about her combat experience was actually more qualified and experienced than most of them. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Corporal Patterson looked as though he might be sick as the full scope of their mistake became clear. The officer they had mocked for her lack of combat experience had actually seen more action than he had. The woman they had dismissed as weak had completed training programs that many men twice her size had failed. General Morrison turned her attention to Sarah, her expression softening slightly. "Lieutenant Chen," she said, "I want you to know that what happened here today does not represent the values or standards of this installation. You have my personal assurance that this matter will be investigated thoroughly and that appropriate action will be taken." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude and relief at the general's words. After weeks of anxiety about her new assignment and the challenge of proving herself at a new base, she had instead found herself subjected to treatment that violated every principle of military professionalism.
This is a
Furthermore, General Morrison continued, I want to apologize on behalf of this installation for the unprofessional and inappropriate treatment you have received. You deserve better, and you will receive better going forward. The apology from such a senior officer was unprecedented in Sarah's experience. Generals did not typically apologize to lieutenants, especially not in front of enlisted personnel. The gesture spoke volumes about the seriousness with which General Morrison viewed the incident. Lieutenant Colonel Santos stepped forward with a document in her hand. Lieutenant Chen, she said, you were supposed to report to my office this morning for your briefing on Project Nightfall. Given the circumstances, I think it's appropriate that we proceed with that briefing now, in the presence of these soldiers.
The mention of Project Nightfall sent another shock through the assembled group.
Project Nightfall was known throughout the base as one of the most classified and sensitive operations in current development. The fact that Sarah was assigned to such a project contradicted everything the enlisted men had assumed about her capabilities and importance.
Colonel Santos opened the document she was carrying, revealing official orders with multiple high-level signatures and security classifications.
Lieutenant Chen has been specifically requested for Project Nightfall by the Pentagon, she announced.
Her assignment to this project was personally approved by the Secretary of Defense based on her exceptional qualifications and proven track record in similar operations. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. The men who had spent the morning questioning Sarah's right to wear an officer's uniform were now learning that she had been personally selected for one of the military's most important assignments by the highest levels of command.
Sergeant Rodriguez looked as though he wanted to disappear. The officer he had described as a diversity hire had actually been handpicked by the Secretary of Defense for a mission of national importance.
The disconnect between his assumptions and reality was so vast that he seemed unable to process the information. General Morrison walked slowly around the group one more time, her gaze lingering on each face. When she spoke again, her voice carried the finality of judgment. Here's what's going to happen, she said with absolute authority. Each of you will report to your respective commanding officers within the hour. You will provide a full written account of this morning's events, and you will submit yourselves to whatever disciplinary action they deem appropriate.
She paused to let this sink in before continuing.
Additionally, you will all attend mandatory training on military courtesy, respect for officers, and equal opportunity. You will complete this training on your own time, and you will demonstrate mastery of the material before you are allowed to return to your regular duties.
The punishments were serious but not career-ending, reflecting both the severity of the offense and General Morrison's recognition that these soldiers could potentially learn from their mistakes and become better service members. Finally, the general concluded, each of you will write a formal letter of apology to Lieutenant Chen.
These letters will be reviewed by your commanding officers and by me personally.
They will demonstrate genuine understanding of what you did wrong and genuine commitment to ensuring that such behavior never happens again.
The requirement for written apologies was perhaps the most humiliating aspect of their punishment, forcing them to confront their actions in writing and acknowledge the personal impact of their behavior on Sarah.
Major General Chen stepped forward, his role as Sarah's father momentarily taking precedence over military protocol.
Sarah, he said, using her first name for the first time during the incident, I'm proud of you for handling this situation with dignity and professionalism. You represented yourself in this army well today. The praise from her father, delivered in front of the very people who had questioned her worthiness to serve, was deeply meaningful to Sarah. It validated not just her response to this particular incident, but her entire career and the choices she had made along the way.
General Morrison turned back to the group of enlisted men one final time.
You are dismissed, she said curtly. Report to your commanding officers immediately.
And remember, your future in this army depends on how you choose to learn from this experience. The men filed out of the corridor with obvious reluctance, their earlier confidence replaced by shame and uncertainty about their futures.
The corridor that had been filled with cruel laughter and harassment was now quiet except for the soft footsteps of departing soldiers. As the enlisted personnel disappeared around the corner, General Morrison turned back to Sarah with an expression of genuine concern.
Lieutenant, she said, how are you really doing?
I know this morning has been difficult. Sarah took a moment to consider her response. The events of the morning had been traumatic and humiliating, but they had also revealed something important about the leadership at Fort Bradley. When faced with injustice, these senior officers had not hesitated to intervene and ensure that proper standards were maintained.
I'm okay, ma'am, Sarah replied honestly.
Thank you for intervening when you did. I wasn't sure how much longer I could maintain my composure. General Morrison nodded approvingly.
Maintaining composure under pressure is one of the most important qualities an officer can possess. You demonstrated that quality admirably today, even under very difficult circumstances. 6 months had passed since the incident in Corridor C, and Fort Bradley had become a different place for Sarah Chen. The morning sun streamed through the same windows, casting familiar shadows across the polished floors. But the atmosphere had fundamentally changed.
Love died in 2017.
Where once she had walked with uncertainty and apprehension, Sarah now moved with the confidence of an officer who had proven herself beyond any doubt.
The Project Nightfall assignment had indeed been everything Lieutenant Colonel Santos had promised, and more.
Sarah's work in cryptography and psychological operations had been instrumental in breaking a major international espionage ring that had been operating for years. Her analysis of intercepted communications had revealed patterns that more experienced analysts had missed, leading to arrests that had saved countless American lives and protected national security interests around the globe. The success of Project Nightfall had elevated Sarah's reputation far beyond Fort Bradley. She had been commended by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, received a personal letter of appreciation from the Secretary of Defense, and been fast-tracked for promotion to captain. More importantly, she had earned the genuine respect of her peers and colleagues through the quality of her work and the professionalism she displayed under pressure. As Sarah walked through Corridor C on her way to another high-level briefing, she reflected on how completely the dynamics had changed. The portraits of distinguished military leaders no longer seemed to question her presence. Instead, they appeared to welcome her as a member of their exclusive fraternity. Her own portrait might one day hang among theirs, she realized with a mixture of pride and determination.
The formal disciplinary actions taken against Sergeant Rodriguez and his companions had sent shockwaves throughout the base. Rodriguez had been demoted to corporal and transferred to a different unit, while Staff Sergeant Thompson had been reduced in rank to sergeant and required to complete an extensive program of professional development.
The other involved personnel had received various levels of punishment, all designed to ensure that such behavior would never be tolerated at Fort Bradley. But perhaps more significant than the formal punishments was the cultural shift that had occurred throughout the installation. General Morrison had used the incident as a catalyst for broader changes in how the base approached issues of respect, professionalism, and equal opportunity. Mandatory training sessions had been implemented for all personnel, and a new system for reporting inappropriate behavior had been established with clear protections for those who came forward. The letters of apology that the enlisted men had been required to write had been particularly impactful. Sarah had been surprised by the genuine remorse expressed in several of them, particularly from Corporal Patterson, who had written eloquently about his realization that his behavior had been not just wrong, but deeply harmful. His letter had included a commitment to become a better soldier and a better person, and from what Sarah had observed, he seemed to be living up to that commitment.
Sergeant Rodriguez's letter had been more perfunctory, showing compliance with orders rather than genuine understanding of his mistakes.
His subsequent behavior had reflected this lack of genuine change, ultimately leading to his transfer from the base. Some people, Sarah had learned, were either unwilling or unable to grow from their mistakes. The transformation in Fort Bradley's culture had benefits that extended far beyond Sarah's personal experience. Other female officers and enlisted personnel had reported feeling more confident in reporting inappropriate behavior, knowing that their concerns would be taken seriously and addressed promptly. The base had become a model for other installations dealing with similar issues. Sarah's relationship with her father had also evolved in unexpected ways. Major General Chen had initially struggled with the balance between his paternal instincts and his professional responsibilities. The incident in the corridor had forced him to confront the reality that his daughter faced challenges in her military career that he, as a man, had never experienced or fully understood. In the months following the incident, they had begun meeting regularly for what they called professional development sessions, but which were really opportunities for honest conversations about leadership, challenges, and the evolving nature of military service.
This is the bogged-down nature of military service, and
These conversations had deepened their relationship and given Sarah insights into leadership that she might not have gained otherwise. General Morrison had become an unexpected mentor to Sarah, inviting her to participate in senior-level planning sessions and exposing her to the strategic thinking that guided major military operations. The general had confided that Sarah's handling of the corridor incident had impressed her as much as her subsequent professional accomplishments. Leadership, she had explained, was often demonstrated, not in moments of triumph, but in how one handled adversity and injustice. The success of Project Nightfall had opened doors for Sarah that she had never imagined possible. She had been invited to brief members of Congress on counterintelligence matters, had consulted with allied nations on cybersecurity threats, and had been offered positions at the Pentagon and other prestigious assignments.
But Fort Bradley had become home in a way that her previous assignments had not, and she had chosen to remain for the time being. Lieutenant Colonel Santos had become both a supervisor and a friend, often remarking that Sarah's combination of technical expertise and emotional intelligence made her one of the most promising officers she had ever worked with.
The two women had collaborated on several classified projects, and Santos had indicated that she was recommending Sarah for accelerated promotion and increased responsibilities. The junior officers and enlisted personnel at Fort Bradley now looked to Sarah as an example of what was possible through hard work, dedication, and perseverance. She had been asked to speak at several military schools and conferences, sharing her experiences and insights with the next generation of military leaders. These speaking engagements had been deeply rewarding, allowing her to help others who might be facing similar challenges.
Colonel Harrison, the Medal of Honor recipient who had witnessed the corridor incident, had become an advocate for Sarah's career advancement.
He had told her that courage came in many forms, and that her willingness to stand up to harassment and maintain her dignity under pressure demonstrated the same kind of bravery that was recognized in combat. His endorsement carried significant weight throughout the military community. The junior enlisted personnel who had witnessed the incident and its aftermath had learned valuable lessons about respect, professionalism, and the consequences of inappropriate behavior. Several had approached Sarah privately to thank her for handling the situation with such grace, noting that her example had helped them understand what it truly meant to be a professional soldier. The physical space of Corridor C had been subtly transformed as well. General Morrison had commissioned a new portrait to be added to the collection of distinguished military leaders lining the walls. The portrait was of Colonel Mary Edwards Walker, the only woman to receive the Medal of Honor, serving as a reminder that women had been making significant contributions to military service long before it was widely recognized or acknowledged.
Sarah's own office had been relocated to the Strategic Operations Division, reflecting her new status and responsibilities.
The space was modest but well appointed, with windows overlooking the parade ground where soldiers conducted their daily training. From her desk, she could see the flag flying over the base headquarters, a constant reminder of the principles and values she had sworn to protect. The relationships Sarah had built with her male colleagues had evolved into genuine partnerships, based on mutual respect and shared professional goals. The initial skepticism and prejudice had been replaced by recognition of her capabilities and appreciation for her contributions. She had proven that excellence knew no gender boundaries. The morning routine that had once filled Sarah with anxiety now brought anticipation for new challenges and opportunities. The same corridors that had once seemed hostile now felt welcoming, filled with colleagues who greeted her with professional respect and personal warmth. Fort Bradley had become not just her assignment but her professional home.
As Sarah approached the briefing room for her morning intelligence update, she encountered a group of newly arrived officers receiving their orientation tour. Among them was a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, who bore the nervous expression that Sarah recognized from her own early days at Fort Bradley.
The tour guide, now Sergeant Patterson, was explaining the history and significance of various areas of the base. When he reached Corridor C, he paused and gestured toward the portraits lining the walls.
"This corridor represents the legacy of leadership at Fort Bradley," he said with evident sincerity. "These portraits remind us that greatness comes in many forms, and that every soldier has the potential to make a significant contribution to our mission and our country."
His words were a far cry from the cruel mockery that had once echoed through the same space. The transformation was complete, not just in policy or procedure, but in the hearts and minds of the people who made Fort Bradley their professional home.
Sarah smiled as she listened to Patterson's words, remembering the journey that had brought them all to this point.
The corridor that had once been a place of humiliation had become a symbol of transformation, growth, and the power of standing up for what was right. The young female officer in the tour group caught Sarah's eye and offered a tentative smile. Sarah nodded encouragingly, hoping to convey that she belonged here as much as anyone else, that her contributions would be valued, and that respect was not something she needed to earn through extraordinary measures, but something she deserved simply by virtue of her service and dedication.
As the tour group moved on and Sarah continued toward her briefing, she reflected on the lesson that the incident in Corridor C had taught everyone involved.
Respect could not be demanded or legislated into existence, but it could be fostered through leadership, example, and the courage to stand up for principles even when it was difficult to do so. The morning briefing awaited, filled with challenges that would test her skills and judgment in new ways. But Sarah approached these challenges with confidence born not of arrogance but of proven capability and the knowledge that she had earned her place through merit, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to excellence.
Fort Bradley had become home. and Sarah Chen had become exactly what she had always aspired to be: a soldier, a leader, and an example of what was possible when talent was recognized, nurtured, and allowed to flourish regardless of the prejudices and assumptions of others.
The corridor was quiet now, filled with morning sunlight and the promise of another day of service to something larger than herself. The portraits on the walls seemed to smile down approvingly at the young officer who had joined their ranks, not through luck or favoritism, but through the timeless military virtues of courage, honor, and commitment to duty. Sarah's story was far from over, but this chapter had ended with triumph not just for her personally, but for the principles of fairness, respect, and professionalism that made the military stronger and more effective. The corridor that had once witnessed mockery now stood as a testament to the power of transformation and the enduring strength of those who refused to be defined by others' limitations or prejudices. As she entered the briefing room and took her place among the senior staff, Sarah knew that she had found not just professional success, but something even more valuable: the respect of her peers, the satisfaction of meaningful work, and the knowledge that she had made a difference not just in her own career, but in the culture and values of the institution she served. The incident in Corridor C had ended with 4 generals walking in and rendering the salute that Sarah had always deserved. But the real victory was not in that moment of vindication, but in the lasting changes that followed, creating a better environment for all who would follow in her footsteps.
George is giving us second edition to the